He's actually the writer, creator, and producer of that TV series that you just saw. So I want you to help me give a warm welcome to Mr. Dallas Jenkins.
Thank you so much. I have been in your shoes before. I have sat in chapel when I was growing up, and when I was in high school, I sat in chapel once a week. And I always hoped for two things: that one, that the guest speaker might say something interesting, something that I could actually enjoy, and two, that he would be done early so that he wouldn't take up the entire period. So I got a clock over there, and I'm going to beat the bell. And so you're going to actually get out a little bit early from chapel today. So applaud me at the end, because I'm going to make your life so much better today. When I was in high school, I'm 46 years old now, so this was a while ago. And I oftentimes didn't quite understand when people would come and share with me, share with our school about their life, or try to give me some sort of sermon. Rarely resonated, because I always felt like what I was experiencing now in my high school years, they weren't experiencing anymore. So they couldn't fully relate. And so oftentimes I just didn't fully resonate with what I was shared. And I often even thought, even though I went to a Christian school, I went to church, I was in a Christian family, it was often hard for me to relate to Bible stories. Bible stories, most of them took place at least 2,000 years ago or longer. In fact, it's one of the reasons why I made The Chosen. We're now 2 seasons in. I'm currently writing season 3, which will begin next year. And one of the main reasons why I created The Chosen was because of when I was in high school. I, A, couldn't quite relate to the stories, couldn't quite relate to the people of the Bible necessarily. And B, there weren't any Christian-based or faith-based movies or TV shows that I liked either. I had a faith, I was a Christian, and I loved movies and I loved TV, and the only good ones were about stuff that had nothing to do with my faith. And anytime there was a Christian movie, or every time there was a Christian show, it was horrible, and I couldn't relate on any level. So one of the things I wanted to say when I decided to come here and share with you was that I made this show in many ways for you, because I really want people like you to have something that you can watch and go, okay, maybe there's something there for me. Maybe these people who lived 2,000 years ago have something that they experienced that I'm also experiencing as well. And that's also what I want to share with you this morning, is I want to share with you what I wish someone would have shared with me when I was sitting in your spot. Because it took me until I was in my early 40s to learn the lesson that I'm going to share with you this morning. And hopefully, what I've got to share with you will save you some of the stress and some of the pain that I went through. Because if you can learn some of these lessons now, as opposed to waiting until you're in your 40s, I do believe that your life and your pursuits will be much smoother and much more God-directed, wherever you are at in your relationship with God, whether it's strong or whether there isn't a relationship with God at all. I think this applies. So I want to share something with you from the book of Matthew. This is Matthew 15, and this is the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Now, there are several stories in the Gospels of Jesus feeding thousands of people with a tiny amount of food. Most likely, scholars agree that it happened twice. Some believe it happened once, but was told in different ways. But most likely it happened twice. And the story that I'm going to share with you from Matthew, this is a version that really resonated with me. And I'm going to read this to you, and then I'm going to tell you why this story changed my life in my 40s, even though I'd heard it 100 times before then. So Matthew 15, verse 32. Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I am unwilling to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. So they were so hungry that if they would have gone home, they would have fainted. They hadn't eaten in 3 days. And the disciples said to him, "Where are we to get enough bread in such a desolate place to feed such a great crowd?" And Jesus said to them, "How many loaves do you have?" They said, "5, and a few small fish." And directing the crowd to sit down on the ground, he took the 5 loaves and fish. In some stories it's 7, one of the stories it's 7, one of the stories it's 5. I use 5. And having given thanks, he broke the bread, gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 7 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. So why does that story matter to me? Well, when I was in high school, I wanted to be a filmmaker. It was shortly after my freshman year when my whole life changed. I'd seen a movie and I thought, that's what I want to do with my life. And so I dedicated myself to that. And my goal was to win an Academy Award. I wanted to be affirmed by Hollywood. I wanted to be successful. And I wanted to make a movie that someday would win me an Academy Award. And I also, more than that, or at least before that, wanted to work with like really big time producers. That was where I wanted to find my value. And so even when I went into college, that was all I thought about. I want to get to Hollywood. I want to make movies. I want to be successful. Now, I did want to make movies about God in some way. I was hoping that would be an opportunity. I was hoping that someday I would get a chance to tell stories of my faith that weren't going to be horrible. And so I did have decent motives in the sense that I wanted to have impact for God, but really my primary goal was I want to win an Academy Award. I used to tell people that. Even when I made my first movie when I was 25, I was like, just so you know, my goal is to win an Academy Award someday. My goal is to work with some of the biggest producers in Hollywood. And for the first 15 years of my career, that didn't happen. I made several movies. They had varying degrees of success, but they were all done, when I say independently, I mean they were financed. All the money came from outside of Hollywood, from private investors. We would make the movie and then hope that a Hollywood studio would pick it up. And fortunately, each of the movies that I made were picked up by major Hollywood studios. So I was having a fair amount of success, but it was always happening after I made the movie. I still wasn't affirmed. I still didn't get an opportunity to make movies with people that were popular, famous, important, had money, all of those things. Even though I lived in Los Angeles for about 10 years, all of the movies that I made were outside of Los Angeles and were financed outside of Los Angeles. Then I get this opportunity in 2010 to come work at a big church in Chicago, which felt ridiculous at the time because I went to Hollywood to make movies and to be successful. And this idea of going back to the Chicago area, which is where I grew up, to make movies there made no sense to me. And working at a church really sounded awful. Even though I went to church, I didn't want to work at one. But very long story short, I ended up taking the opportunity. And so I went back to Chicago, and for the first 5 years, I also didn't get a chance. I ended up not getting a chance to make a movie for the first few years. So many other things were happening. The opportunities weren't there. The script that we were working on wasn't quite working. And so I was doing all these other things at the church that weren't making a movie. So that was one of the first moments in my life where I was really thinking, I am really far from my goal. I'm now in a suburb of Chicago. I'm working at a church. I'm not making movies like what I was intending to do. And I'm far from Hollywood, far from success, far from where I really wanted to be for the last 20 years. And then I made a short film for my church's Christmas Eve service. And it was just because I was so desperate to make something, make anything. I really just wanted to, fill this time while I was here, while we were trying to develop this other movie. And the short film ended up being really popular at our church and ended up getting to a few film festivals, and through a mutual friend got in the hands of one of the biggest producers in Hollywood, a guy by the name of Jason Blum. And he saw this short film and loved it and was thinking, I want to actually get into faith-based films. I want to see how that works. Now, Jason Blum you probably haven't heard of him because most producers aren't famous, but he is responsible for almost every single horror film of the last 10 years. So any horror film from Get Out to Us to Sinister, Insidious, all these movies, he's a horror film producer. And has no interest personally in faith, but was interested in potentially doing faith-based movies because he thought, these could make decent money. So this is a really successful producer, has been nominated for Academy Awards. He loved my short film. Well, he partners up with WWE. That's the wrestling company. And they have a film division. So they were also interested in faith-based movies. And they saw my short film and loved it. And I sent them the script that we were developing that was set in this church, and it was this really cool faith-based story, and they loved that. They said, this is what we want to do. So a horror film company, a wrestling company, and a church in Elgin, Illinois, all combined to produce this movie that I wanted to make. And this was my dream scenario, because we were going to be filming it in the Chicago area, so I'm near my home. We're filming it at this church. It's a church story. It's a God story. It's a faith story. I didn't have to change anything for these guys because they wanted me to do a faith-based movie. And these are some of the biggest producers in Hollywood who are now financing and producing my film. I had arrived. And I remember thinking during that time, this is what I have wanted for 20 years. This is it. And so I made the movie, and they loved the movie. And they're thinking, we're going to do more of these. And so for the next 10 years, they wanted to do 5 movies with me, and I was a director with an extraordinarily bright future. And so as I'm making the movie, and we finish it, everything's going well, and then they do what's called testing, audience testing, where they pick an audience randomly. This was in Orange County, California, and this audience comes, and they give all their reactions to the movie and fill out their test, what they call test scores. And it was the highest tested movie that either of these companies had ever done. The movie scored in these hugely high numbers. People were loving it, and they were like, oh my goodness, we're going to release this in theaters. This is going to be big, and this is going to launch a new initiative of more faith-based films over the next 10 years, and Dallas is going to do them. And again, now I'm flying even higher. So then it comes time for the movie to come out in theaters. So in 2017, it was January 20th, it was a Friday. Movies are released on Fridays, not when it's not during the summer. It was Friday, January 20th, and I'll never forget that day. Because on that morning, get up, and I'm like, this is it. This is the launch of my movie that everyone's excited about. And early in the afternoon on Friday, the numbers will start coming in from the first theater showings. And you know within the first 2 hours how your movie is going to do for the rest of the weekend. They can predict it easily just from those numbers. And the movie was a complete and total bomb. It was, the numbers were coming in, and they were lower than their lowest projections, their lowest guesses. And in 2 hours, I went from being a director with a very bright future to being a director with no future. Because those same companies that were excited to make movies with me in the future immediately were like, yep, I guess we don't understand the faith-based crowd. I guess we don't understand faith movies. We're going to go back to doing what we do best, horror films and wrestling. Nice. That's cool. It's like a little shaker accompaniment to my speech. It means listen. So I was done for. I had no future now. I didn't know actually what was coming next. I didn't know if anything was coming next. And I got to this point where I actually I went home from my office. I went home to my wife. My kids were in school, so we had the house to ourselves. And I genuinely didn't know if I was going to make another movie again. Because when you make a movie that bombs, people don't exactly line up around the block to do it with you again. And these companies were already saying, like, yeah, we're really sorry. They weren't mean about it. I understood where they were coming from. But now I didn't have anything going for my future. And I was at a low point. And so my wife and I were crying and confused. And one of the things that we were so confused about was that everything that had happened up to that point had seemed so God-led. Like so many doors had opened that so clearly were God doing it. And so many things that had happened over the last 2 years, some of them really cool moments and really cool opportunities, and at the time they felt like God was really behind this. And then it failed. And when something fails, you assume, oh, I guess God isn't in it. I guess I must have been wrong. God didn't give me that. That must have been my own thoughts and my own prayers that weren't answered properly. So I really wondered, where is God in all this? And maybe I'm not even supposed to be doing this anymore. And so in that moment, at one point, I went off to another room And my wife came to me and she said, I've been praying, and God is really putting it hard on my heart, the story of the feeding of the 5,000 in the Bible. Like pressing, it's just so clearly, like go to the story of the feeding of the 5,000. So we went to that story and we read it like I just did to you. And in that story, we started noticing a couple things that we hadn't noticed before, even though we'd heard this story many times. And one of them was this part where Jesus says, and I mentioned this to you before, I'm unwilling to send them away hungry lest they faint along the way. They've been with me now 3 days. So he knew how hungry they were. And in fact, it was his fault. He's the one who'd been talking for 3 days. He brought them actually to a place of hunger and of desperation where the only thing left was a miracle, because they couldn't even go home to get food like normal because they were so hungry they would faint. And that Jesus was responsible for that. So that was strange when I read that, and it hadn't really hit me like that before. And so like, well, where are we supposed to get all this bread? And he said, well, find out what you have. And they had these loaves and fish. And then he multiplied the loaves and fish. So he brought them to the place of the miracle. He brought them to the place where they needed something so badly that only a miracle would do, only what he could do. So we thought, all right, so what does this mean for us? We thought, this means a miracle's coming. This means that we're at this hungry and desperate place where the only thing left is a miracle. Well, it's Friday afternoon and the numbers are so low, but what if they get multiplied like Jesus multiplied these loaves and fish? And that afternoon, one of the co-writers of the movie texts me and says, yeah, it's so disappointing to hear about the numbers. I don't know what this means, but God just really had me reading the story of the feeding of the 5,000. I was reading this devotional book, and it just happened to come up, and so I just feel somewhat encouraged by this story. I'm like, wow, that's really cool. God's really putting this story on the heart of people. There must be something in there for me. And we were like, the numbers are going to multiply miraculously, and everything's going to turn around quickly. And that didn't happen. That night, the numbers got even worse. And now I'm thinking, well, what am I supposed to have learned from this story then? What is God trying to tell me? I can't figure it out. And my wife can't figure it out. We know God wants us in this story, but we just don't know what we're supposed to do. So I did what I do pretty well. That night, I stayed up really late, and I analyzed. I'm really good at analyzing things. I'm really good at doing things, making smart decisions based on the information that I have. And I thought, well, clearly I made a poor decision in this case. I want to figure out why. So I spent 5 hours doing what we call a post-mortem. A post-mortem is typically what we do in business, where you analyze everything that went wrong so that you don't do it again. So I was writing a 15-page memo of everything that had gone wrong and everything that I had done wrong and every decision that I had made that was incorrect and a failure. And so I'm in the middle of writing this, and I'm at page 15. I'm just pouring myself out. Here's what I did wrong here. Here's the decision I made wrong here. Here's where I went left instead of right. Here's where I failed. And at that moment, up on Facebook, this is at 4 o'clock in the morning, I get a message from someone who I've never met. We're Facebook friends, but in fact, I'm going to actually show it to you because I still have it. I've kept it here. But this is the little Facebook exchange that we had. And go to the next slide, because I punched in on what he said to me out of the blue. He didn't say hi, didn't say hello, didn't say heard about your movie. He said, remember, your job, it's not your job to feed the 5,000. Your job is to bring your loaves and fish, your bread and fish. What you can see there, it's kind of cut off, is I said, if you don't mind me asking, why did you just tell me that? Because it's 4 in the morning, and he goes on to share that he's in Romania, he's on a different time zone. And I said, it's just really strange that you said that to me. And if you go to the next slide, you can see what he says. He says, well, it wasn't me. I felt led to tell you that right now. He was in Romania on a different time zone, because I was like, what are you doing up at this time of day or time of night? He says, well, I'm on this different time zone. I'm visiting my brother. And a couple years later, when I talked to him, I still haven't met him yet. We just happened to be Facebook friends. And he shared with me that he was walking home from a grocery store in Romania, and had been a fan that was really hoping that my movie would do well. And he looked up the numbers online on his phone and saw that it was a failure. And he was like, oh man, I was really hoping that movie would succeed. I really liked that movie. And he said, God, like as clearly as it was an audible voice, it wasn't an audible voice, but it was that clear. Tell Dallas it's not his job to feed the 5,000, it's only provide the loaves and fish. And he was like, no, I barely know the guy. That's a pretty presumptuous thing to say to somebody. And he felt really strongly on his heart, tell Dallas this. So he's like, okay. And he sends me this Facebook message. And he knows what time it is, so he's thinking, yeah, Dallas, I guess I'll see this tomorrow. And I instantly responded with, why did you say that to me? And that moment changed my life. I can define who I was before then, and I can define who I was after then. Because up until that moment, I was someone who did feel responsible for success. I wanted to succeed. I wanted to achieve. I wanted to be affirmed. I wanted to be legitimate. And I even wanted to have impact, even with that movie, which was a gospel-centered movie, which had a message of faith. I'm thinking, this is a great goal for me to have. I want to have impact. I want to impact people like you. I want people to be able to watch my stuff and have their lives changed. And God was telling me, obviously, as clearly as he could, this is what I wanted you to get from this. It's not your job to feed the 5,000. It's only to provide the loaves and fish. So as the story goes in the Gospels, in another telling of it, it was a boy who provided these loaves and fish. When the boy went home that day, certainly he didn't say to his parents, I fed 5,000 people today. Obviously he didn't say that. He was like, I provided what I had. I had these 5 loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus himself said that's what he wanted. That's all he asked of me. He asked, what do we got? I gave my 5 loaves and 2 fish. And then he did these amazing things with it. That was a lesson that was extremely hard for me to learn and understand until that moment. And in that moment, I became someone who no longer cared about success, no longer cared about impact. Well, I cared about impact, meaning I hoped that it happened, but it wasn't my responsibility. I only cared from then on of providing whatever I had to God, the best of my ability, and everything after that is up to him. When he deems my contribution worthy of acceptance, the transaction is over. And everything after that is his. And it doesn't matter what it is or what it looks like. And I'm perfectly okay with that at this moment in my life. And I'd never been there before. Starting from young all the way up until my 40s, it was, I can achieve, I can do this, I can be successful, I can be affirmed. And I got that, and then it was all taken away from me. And in that moment, right then and there, I didn't actually care. I thought, the God of the universe, the God who created me and everything, is wanting to tell me something right now, so clearly and powerfully. It's not a coincidence that God laid that on my wife's heart, God laid that on my co-writer's heart, and God laid that on this man's heart, who I still haven't met. God has something for me, and I don't want to miss it. I don't want to miss out on whatever this means, whatever this is going to look like. And so in that moment, I was willing to never make another movie. I was willing to only do what God wanted of me and to only give what I had, whatever that meant. For the first time in my life, I was willing to do whatever he wanted and not just what I wanted. And so that weekend, I shared my thoughts on Facebook. I actually just wrote out kind of what was on my heart at the time. So I'm going to flash forward for just a few months, and I'm going to come back to that. A few months later, I had the opportunity to do another short film for my church. It's about the birth of Christ from the perspective of the shepherds. It was an idea I'd had 2 years earlier, but I'd put aside because I had the opportunity now to do this big Hollywood movie. Well, now I don't have this opportunity anymore. I've got some time, and the church was like, well, remember that idea that you had for Christmas? Let's do that. So on my friend's farm, 20 minutes from my house in Illinois, behind his barn, we filmed this 20-minute short film about the birth of Christ. And we were filming it in like June or July because we were wanting to get ready in time before the snow came in Chicago. There's snow. It's this white stuff that comes from the sky. It's really cool. You should see it sometime. And we wanted to make this short film before it happened. So I made it in like June or July. And while I was filming it, I remember thinking to myself, on this farm of my friend in Illinois, this is not Hollywood. This is not a big movie that's going to come out in theaters. And yet, for some reason, I'm perfectly cool with it. These are my loaves and fish. Feels like not even 5 loaves. Feels like 1 loaf and 1 small fish. But it's something. And I'm resonating with this. This means something to me. I'm happy. I'm joyous. I've never felt like I haven't been this excited while I'm making something. And this is a small little thing for my church. It's a story of the birth of Jesus, which I've heard so many times, but it's from different perspectives. And while I was shooting it, that's when I had this idea for the show, The Chosen. And so that idea of telling the stories of Jesus but from different perspectives came to me, and I thought there's never been actually a multi-season show about the life of Jesus where you can really dig into the characters and make them relatable and make them people that are like you and me. And all that I've known is just when I read it on the pages in the Bible, I believe in the Bible and I've learned a lot, but I don't know that I can fully relate to these people all the time. And I want to make a show where you can really dig into these people, like all the great shows that I watch, that I binge watch with my wife. I want to make a show like that. Well, of course, it seemed ridiculous because I'm thinking all that while I'm on a farm in Illinois. And there's not people, like I said earlier, lining up around the block to work with Dallas Jenkins, whose movie was just a big failure. Long story short, as you know, The Chosen ended up happening. And it became the #1 highest crowdfunded media project of all time. And now we're going into season 3, and it's in every country in the world. And every day we hear from people whose lives are being changed. But that's not the point of the story. That weekend, I wrote this on Facebook. And this is before The Chosen even existed, before The Chosen was even on my brain. And I wrote this note, and I hope it has something for you. I said, so what do you do when something you poured yourself into just doesn't land? I won't mince words. My movie, The Resurrection of Gavin Stone, had a very disappointing opening weekend and an even more disappointing day yesterday. Yes, we've gotten good feedback from those who've seen it, and it's had tremendous impact on multiple churches and individuals, and that's the main reason we do these movies. But to be able to make more movies, your movie has to perform. And people on a large scale need to want to see it. And as much as I can point to multiple factors that impacted the box office, I can't play the blame game. Something I created and believed in and thought would work simply didn't connect on a measurable level. People didn't want to see it in a theater, and I thought they would, period. So what do you do when that happens in any career path, in any moment in your life, when something that you want to do fails? Well, certainly sadness is a factor, and my wife and I have dealt with that over the last week for sure. Questioning yourself and the future is all part of it. But Amanda and I did something that has sustained us through this time. We pursued God and sought to hear what we could from him. I've told this story many times, and it still takes me back to that moment. He made it 100% clear to us and through others who felt led to share something with me that I'm only to bring my 5 loaves and 2 fish. The rest is up to him. And I can honestly say I'm better spiritually right now than I've ever been. For the first time in my life, I would be 100% fine if I couldn't make another movie. That's actually a great place to be in. In my speaking engagements, I often quote my friend and unintentional mentor, the great Phil Vischer, who created VeggieTales 25 years ago. He says, where you're going to be in 5 years is none of your business. And now I'm fully living that out. I have no idea what's next. I have no idea if I'll make another movie. And while that sucks career-wise, sorry if I'm not supposed to say that word here, it's truly enriching spiritually. I'm serious. I feel a sense of comfort and peace and contentment and, yes, joy that you wouldn't normally expect after the biggest disappointment of your career. That's what a relationship with Christ does. Joy, regardless of happiness, whether you're happy or sad, is irrelevant if you have joy. Freedom, regardless of opportunity. So don't hold on to things too tightly. Realize you're not as smart as you thought you were. It feels good. Trust me. That's what I have for you this morning. Even at this stage, where you're at in 5 years is none of your business. I know it's what you're being asked a lot. What do you want to do? What do you want to be? Where do you want to go? What's your career path? What's your major? Sometimes you can just answer, sorry, Mom and Dad. Sorry, counselor. Where I'm at in 5 years is none of my business. I'll get there. Don't hold on to things too tightly, because what you think you might want might not be what God has for you. Realize you're not as smart as you thought you were. These are all things that hit me in the lowest moment of my life, and it became the best moment of my life. And so I wrote this the other day as I was thinking about what I wanted to share with you. And I wrote this. So what does this mean? That everything you bring is going to be what the world deems successful? Because The Chosen now has become one of the most successful projects of the last several years. Of course, I didn't know that that was going to happen when I wrote this earlier. Of course not. My lesson was learned before The Chosen took off. And if The Chosen would have bombed financially, I'd be giving you the exact same message right now. In fact, I actually gave this talk. I shared this story before The Chosen even existed. The message is what having this mindset and this approach and this relationship with Christ really does for you. Joy regardless of happiness, hope regardless of circumstance. So I do ask you, I know this may sound cheesy, but bring your 5 loaves and 2 fish, make them as good as they can be. Because that's the interesting part of the story. Jesus didn't do everything in it. He could have just waved his hand like this, and loaves and fish could have just appeared in people's laps magically. But he still said, no, I need you to do something. You go bring me the 5 loaves and 2 fish. And then when it came time to distribute them, he had the disciples do their part. He had them do everything that they didn't need him for, so that the only thing left was what only he could do. So you still do bring your 5 loaves and 2 fish, and you still do make them as good and healthy as they can be, so that when you have that opportunity to bring them to God, and you have that opportunity to do something special, that God deems them worthy of acceptance. And if he does, then the transaction is over, and the rest is up to him. I'm going to close in prayer. God, thank you for this time together, and thank you for the student who is sitting here today who might have needed to hear what you have to say, like I did. And I pray that in this moment that you will communicate and lay on their hearts that you are real, that you are here, that you have a plan for them that might be different from theirs or from anyone else's about them. And that if they don't know you fully well yet, that you would make yourself known, and make it as obvious as it was to me, because I needed it to be obvious. Please do the same. And I ask that you work in the lives of each and every person at this school, this incredible, incredible school, this opportunity that these students and teachers and parents have to learn more about you in an environment that is so huge and has such great opportunity. I pray that you will make it not about that you will make it not about the size of the school or the immense opportunity or all of the incredible things that this school has to offer, but that it's just about that relationship with you, because there will be times when those opportunities turn into failures. And in those moments, when it's not as safe as it is now, I pray that you will be there. Thank you in advance for what you're going to do. Thank you for this opportunity. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen.